Davy Crockett is finally remembered as the king of the wild frontier, a principled politician, and the last defender of the Alamo. But the truth about this frontiersman is a lot more complicated than that. Davy Crockett was born on August 17, 1786, near the town of Limestone. A state park commemorates the spot, which is now part of Tennessee. The volunteer state claims Crockett as a native son and hero, and indeed, he served in the Tennessee General Assembly before representing one of its congressional districts. And the theme song to the Disney series even began with the phrase, "Born on a mountaintop in Tennessee." There's two things we need to address. The Crockett home, while relatively remote, wasn't actually on a mountaintop. And at the time he was born, it wasn't part of Tennessee. The Scots-Irish settlers who populated the region aimed to organize it into a new state named Franklin. In 1784, when Franklin narrowly lost the vote necessary to receive statehood from Congress, its constituents broke away from North Carolina and became an independent republic. This story is pretty complicated. Just to sort of wrap it up, North Carolina then reabsorbed the republic in 1789, ceded that land plus some west of there back to the US government, and that's how we ended up with the state of Tennessee. Back to our main story. No, not born on a mountaintop, not in Tennessee. That being said, born in a remote section of the state of Franklin during its separation from North Carolina and prior to becoming the state of Tennessee doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, so it's really okay they lied a song there. The first episode of Disney's Davy Crockett series was entitled Davy Crockett, Indian Fighter. It was loosely based around the Creek War, the clash between the Red Stick faction of the Creek Indians in the United States between 1813 and 1814. Disney presented Crockett as an active combatant who personally fought and bested the Red Stick leader before convincing him to make peace. And then there's the 1960 film The Alamo, starring John Wayne as Crockett, who says that fighting against Native Americans was the only soldiering he ever did before coming to Texas. The real David Crockett was a proud veteran of the Creek War who used his service to his advantage when on the political campaign trail later in life. But Crockett wasn't actually an Indian fighter in the Creek War or any other conflict between white settlers and Native Americans. He was a first-rate hunter and scout, and his service as a volunteer was largely spent in those roles, hunting and scouting. By his own admission, he didn't believe that he was suited to warfare, and contemporary and historical assessments of his character paint a picture of a man too friendly to be a fierce combatant. So he didn't exactly fib about his service.
Davy Crockett don't lie.
Texas Monthly once described David Crockett as perhaps the first American to make a living portraying his own fanciful image. Imagine a world where people are famous for being famous.
I think it has served me well.
Though essentially an honest man, he loved to entertain with boasts about his hunting expeditions. Once he became involved in politics, he turned his natural charm to his advantage. You could certainly make the case that he was an early example of a famous person becoming a politician. Outgunned financially by his opponents, he told stories, cracked jokes, and on one occasion took the wind out of another candidate's sails by memorizing his stump speech and delivering it before he could. Crockett's celebrity really exploded nationwide by the time he reached the Capitol. His image as a buckskin-clad, semi-literate outdoorsman was lauded and lambasted in equal measure. The tippy top of his fame happened when he was fictionalized as Nimrod Wildfire in The Lion of the West, a successful play that celebrated the frontiersman portrayal in heavily caricatured fashion. Crockett attended the play's Washington benefit performance in 1831 or so, and he continued to trade on his frontier image. But he was ambivalent and at times resentful about how much this caricature drove his reputation. He wanted to be accepted as a gentleman, and he took care to dress and speak well when keeping company in Washington. Imagine the disappointment when visitors met Crockett there clad in a suit, no buckskin clothing, and wait till you hear about his hat. The Lion of the West did much to amplify popular legends about Crockett. The illustration that graced the playbill and the cover that appeared on Davy Crockett's almanac fixed his image in the public mind of a half-wild frontiersman wearing a fur cap and dressed head to toe in buckskins. The initial illustrations featured a hat made of a wildcat pelt, but over time the coonskin became fixed as the one and only Crockett cap. Hunting raccoons was part of Crockett's public persona. Speaking of, if you know the song, you're probably wondering about the other thing he hunted. We can't speak to any incident at the age of 3, but yes, Davy Crockett killed bears. Lots of bears. Lots and lots of bears. Let's just leave it at that.
Well, that's just great. Bears. Now you're putting the whole station in jeopardy.
His political opponents castigated him as an unserious coon killer, while he himself told tales of getting raccoons out of trees just by grinning. But there's no record of him ever having worn a fur hat of any kind before Nimrod Wildfire came along. When he arranged for a portrait of himself in frontier garb, he posed not with a coonskin cap, but with a popular felt hat with a wide brim. Accounts of Crockett setting out for Texas or lying dead in the Alamo feature him wearing the coonskin, or at least a distinctive hat, but these stories emerged well after his death. Assuming that these accounts weren't colored by Crockett's popular image, they indicate that he only started wearing his trademark headgear at the very end of his life.
Do you think I'm going to dress like any self-respecting congressman? No. I got to go in there like the king of the wild frontier, thanks to you.
In the second episode of the Disney series Davy Crockett Goes to Congress, Crockett loses his congressional seat and any hopes for higher office when he opposes Andrew Jackson's Indian removal bill. This opposition is historically accurate, and it was also principled. Crockett was against the lack of congressional oversight to the funds that were granted to Jackson. In fact, he once introduced a bill to eliminate West Point because he thought it was basically a money laundering system for rich folks' kids. But with the Indian removal bill, he sympathized with the native tribes who would be displaced, fearing it would lead to a miserable fate to the tribes. Spoiler, he was right. But this vote didn't really represent either the high or low point of Crockett's time in politics. While he did lose his seat in the 1830 referendum, he was also re-elected 2 years later.
A bill like this would never live long enough to even get on our desk, let alone come to a vote.
Re-election didn't bring any changes to Crockett's notoriously empty list of legislative accomplishments, but it did temporarily endear him to the leaders of the Whig Party, who courted Crockett as a potential presidential candidate for the 1836 election. How seriously Crockett took a possible White House run isn't clear, but he was ultimately too independent-minded for the Whigs or any political party. Abandoned by his Whig allies after losing his congressional seat again, and hounded by supporters of Andrew Jackson, Crockett's political career seemed finished. As for his personal life, he was estranged from his wife and her family. Texas, which was at the time still a territory of Mexico open to American settlers, offered a fresh start. Old friends like Sam Houston had relocated there, and opportunities for hunting and leisure abounded. By the time that Crockett set out for Texas, tensions between the Texians and the Central Authority in Mexico were inflamed and well known to Americans. But contrary to the 1960 Alamo film and other fictionalized accounts, Crockett didn't go there with a mind for battle. When he arrived in January 1836, it appeared to many Texians that the fighting was over, or at least a far-off prospect. Crockett wrote back home that he was sure that he'd be elected to help with the state constitution. It was only after he arrived and caught the whiff of adventure in the air that he began claiming he meant to fight.
And I feel sure that where Crockett leads, his men will follow.
Popular accounts about the siege of the Alamo are full of myths, half-truths, and outright lies. But one thing they generally get right is that command of the garrison was shared by William Barrett Travis and Jim Bowie, or at least until the latter fell sick. But in many popular accounts, David Crockett is presented as a de facto third commander, present for all major decisions and deep in Travis's and Bowie's competence. But Crockett was no officer, only a private, and he may not even have been the leader of the so-called Tennessee Mounted Volunteers. He originally came to Texas with 3 companions. According to the 3 Roads to the Alamo, when he enlisted with the militia and made off for San Antonio, he became the informal leader of a slightly larger group, but William B. Harrison was the party's commander. Either way, Crockett was certainly famous and celebrated, but third in command, he was not. A counter-myth, which was presented in the 2004 film The Alamo, portrays Crockett as insecure and lost within the fortress walls. But letters from Travis and survivor accounts shared by historians on the DVD's behind-the-scenes features paint him as an energetic cheerleader and entertainer to the men, helping them to stay brave and dutiful. There are 2 popular myths regarding how David Crockett died during the Battle of the Alamo on March 6, 1836. One, which was popularized heavily in the mid-20th century, is that he went down fighting. The Disney miniseries ended with him as literally the last defender left at the Alamo, swinging his rifle like a club against an onslaught of Mexican soldiers. 1960's Alamo movie, meanwhile, shows him being mortally wounded before destroying the garrison's supply of gunpowder, thus denying it to the enemy. This story has some support in the historical record, as various survivors reportedly said that they saw Crockett dead but surrounded by the men that he had slain. But according to 3 Roads to the Alamo, these accounts were recorded from secondhand sources and were told well after the fact. And the report that Crockett went down swinging has competition from an alternative telling in which he was instead executed after being captured. According to several sources, including the diary of Mexican soldier Jose Enrique de la Peña, this account claims that Crockett and other soldiers were taken prisoner by a general who asked that they receive clemency, but instead Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna had them killed. There's a report in a letter from a George M. Dolson that echoes the captured/shot version, and about 3 weeks after the Alamo, a New Orleans newspaper carried that same story. The authenticity of the diary is reportedly solid, but that doesn't mean it's accurate. There's some dispute to if Crockett was indeed one of the men executed after the battle. Ultimately, the only certainty about Crockett's death is that he died at the Alamo.